think the most useful thing to do would be to kind of back up and explain how we even get to this position. And then we'll talk a little bit about this specific line as well. Because actually it's a very fundamental line in e4, e5 lore. It's very, very central for both sides. This comes from the Italian game. Bishop c4, bishop to c5. Of course, black has other options already here. They can play knight f6, which allows the fried liver, and this kind of has its own, bucket of theory. This is super, super sharp. So for players that don't want to deal with this, they play bishop to c5, keeping the queen covering the g5 square. But the drawback to this one is that white gets some extra options with c3 and d4 hitting the bishop. And this was one of the main openings that they played literally when chess was modern chess was being invented. In fact, one of the earliest chess masters, Giuoco, played this opening a bunch and had many, many nice wins from this and similar lines, King's Gambit and similar idea. His point was he was just trying to play as actively as possible out of the opening, willing to sacrifice pawns to take control over the center and activate the pieces. So Giuoco actually had a couple of games. This is literally something we've known for over 400 years at this point, which is kind of amazing for chess theory. But Giuoco had a number of games that went like this: takes, bishop to b4 check. Because actually this is an extremely logical and principled line from both sides. If you think about it, white goes e4, black goes e5, white attacks the pawn, black defends, white develops, black develops, and now white goes c3. So white tries to use the advantage of the first move to push d4 and take full control over the center. And if black doesn't actually play a challenging move like knight f6, I think queen e7 also was playable or whatever, black plays some random move here like a6, h6, which has happened, quite a bit in chess history. White plays d4 and is already doing extremely well because white hits the bishop, white hits the e-pawn, forcing black to take, and after white takes, white just gets the perfect strong center, and knight gets to develop out actively to c3, bishop comes to g5, and white already has a big advantage. So it's up to black to kind of neutralize this initiative out of the opening, right? So knight f6 is a very important move because it attacks the e-pawn. Now after d4, takes, if black plays some passive move like bishop b6 or bishop e7, doesn't give this check, which is a very important tempo for black. But again, if they just back up, then white can defend the pawn with knight c3. I think d5 is strong, e5 is also strong. White just gets this huge initiative here with the pawns, and immediately is just doing fantastic out of this opening. Because the pawns are just going to move up, black's knights are going to have to move out of the way, and white's just going to have a crushing initiative right out of the opening. e5 here also strong, allows d5, but I think white is still doing quite well here. Again, knight c3, and white is already very, very happy. So again, it's up to black to play really, really precisely. So bishop b4 check. And now, next move, black is actually taking the e-pawn. Even if white goes bishop d2, black has other options, but they can actually just grab this pawn. And if they don't take this pawn, in many lines, white just ends up with a very strong center, right? So it's really up to black. They kind of have to accept a lot of these gambits, because otherwise white just gets a big center and just gets a huge advantage right out of the opening, just by force. So knight c3, this was the way that Giuoco originally played this position. And his idea was that, number one, if black doesn't take the pawn, he's just getting a huge advantage in the center and a huge lead in development. And secondly, after black does take the pawn, he just continues playing for development. He just castles here, which is honestly genius, that they already figured this out in 400 years ago, that in the opening, in sharp open positions, you should just play for development. You shouldn't worry about giving up a pawn or two, just get your pieces out. And so he won a couple of famous games here where black, now the knight is hanging on e4, so black has to do something, continues to take material, takes, bishop takes c3 was played in many games, but then Giuoco just crushed a number of people with this idea, queen to b3. Very, very strong move, with a double attack hitting the bishop and also targeting the f7 pawn. And the problem for black is that they're just not in time. If black could have already castled in this position, black could maybe be okay, but here black is just not in time to get the king out. Here if they castle, they're just losing the bishop. Yeah, there's a couple of games where his opponents took the rook, bishop takes f7, king f8, bishop g5 was played, just absolutely crushing, knight e7, knight e5. I've seen these games a million times, so I know them by heart. I've shown them to classes and students and stuff. And this move, knight e5, threatening bishop g8, for example, with mate on f7, think, yeah, a couple of games like d5, queen f3, and it was just game over. Bishop f5, bishop e6, and yeah, it was just GG. Pretty sure one game was like this: g6 check, and then mate, bishop f7, or maybe this was analysis. Who knows from those times? Anyway, so Greco kind of showed like you just can't be this greedy with black out of the opening. Nowadays, if you ask the engine, I think it'll tell you bishop a3 is even stronger than queen b3. It's just completely crushing for white. And so they actually tried bishop e7 here for a while, but then it was discovered, because here black already captured one pawn, right? So it says, okay, I won't take the second pawn. I'll just drop my bishop back and just try to castle and be one pawn up. But then white figured out that they can go d5 here. Black should probably go knight a5, hitting the bishop, and then d6, very, very important move. Otherwise, black would play d6 and just get the pieces out and just be absolutely fine. White goes d6. Knight can't take on c4 because d takes e7, traps the queen, and then after queen takes e7, rook e1, then wins the queen. Knight e5 is, not good enough. So on d6, black has to take the pawn. If they take with the pawn, white has to sacrifice. Bishop takes f7. This has been known for like over 100 years, so this is not new information I'm sharing. White has this winning sac. Bishop takes f7. Takes, queen d5 check. There were already games like this. King f8, white can go bishop g5, knight to g5. And essentially just crushing. It's a piece sacrifice, but black's pieces are stuck on the queen side thanks to this d6 move, especially the bishop and rook are just totally trapped. And by the time black is able to get anything out, the king is just already going to be getting mated because white has 5 pieces ready to go in the center and just win. So this is just losing for black. And if takes on d6, then it was discovered white can win by force here with rook e1, bishop e7, bishop g5. Now only move f6. So knight c6, I think white just goes here and then just takes and takes on e7 and wins everything. And on f6, white can take on f6 with a very nice winning combination, similar to the Greco thing with knight e5. Turning queen h5, queen f7 mate, and black just has no defense. The king is just getting mated. So, because of these games that were played, black kind of figured out, maybe knight takes c3 is kind of too dangerous. Because after bc, you can't take the pawn, you can't go bishop e7, bishop a5, rook e1 check is unthinkable. So they realized, you know what, we have to go bishop takes c3. And this actually makes a lot of sense, because after bc3, now white is finally not threatening anything for one move, and this gives black time to play d5. And if black can get this move in, black is just absolutely fine. Here black even keeps the extra pawn and is more than fine. Black is going to be able to castle next move, the bishop comes out, and strategically, like, black has no problems, white has no compensation, yeah? So after bishop takes c3, it was now white's turn to come up with an improvement and figure out how to kind of revive the line and get some initiative. And then someone figured out they can play d5 here, which is really a spectacular move because black just captured a piece, and now white pushes d5. Maybe this was Mahler himself. Maybe, I don't know exactly where the Mahler attack starts and where it ends, but maybe this was Mahler's contribution. I'm not exactly sure. But this is now like the move that white came up with to pose problems. And the idea is that white puts their own pawn on d5, right? So that black can't play d5 themselves. And now white is going to win the piece back eventually because black still has multiple pieces under attack, and the knight on e4 is always vulnerable as well. But the idea is that here black isn't able to develop with their d5 move. So here white is still keeping a lot of initiative. Yeah, for example, like the main move here is bishop f6, as people have since figured out and analyzed. But for a while, people would just play like knight e7, right? And then white takes on c3. And then let's say black plays d6 here. White goes queen d4. Like, white gets some very nice initiative here if black doesn't really know what they're doing. Knight f6, bishop g5. The rooks come to e1. White is ready to take on f6. It's a ton of play for just one pawn. So this wasn't working. I think for some time black was trying this move knight e5 here. Which makes a lot of sense, because if takes, then black can save the bishop and try to play d6. But here, white usually goes bc3, knight takes c4, and queen d4. Really, like, cool line where both knights are under attack and white hits the g7 pawn as well. And if black tries to defend one of their knights with like knight d6 or something, then queen takes g7 just looks super, super dangerous. Rook e1, the rook is hanging, and obviously the knight on d6 is also stunting the rest of black's development. And that's a lot of where white's playing this line comes from, just from stunting the development and then getting the pieces out. So I think instead, like, black is supposed to be okay here if they just castle and give back one of the knights, and you know, white has like reasonable compensation. I think white can take either way. Let's say queen takes e4, knight d6, queen f4. I think white gets very reasonable compensation here. Although I believe this position is playable, but yeah, it looks kind of unpleasant for black because we have the opposite color bishops, and white's bishop on the long diagonal is going to be really, really annoying to deal with. So at some point, bishop f6 here took over as the main line. Now black's idea is that if white takes this one, then black is in time to castle. And basically black kind of solves all their issues. White doesn't get any kind of like particular initiative here. So then white figured out, okay, we got to go rook e1. Like this is the only way to fight for the initiative. Taking the knight on e4 so that black has to figure out where to put this knight on c6. And so nowadays, like, I mean, this line has just been analyzed out to death. So I'll just show you guys kind of the main line. Black goes knight e7, rook takes e4, and d6. Very important move. Otherwise, white will play d6, and black's development will be very difficult. And again, white will just get huge play. D6, white usually goes bishop g5 here to keep the initiative going. Takes. Now if black were to castle in this position, there's actually knight takes h7, the sacrifice. Which I don't think it exactly wins by force, but it's supposed to be quite dangerous for black, with ideas of like queen h5 check, rook h4, and so on. So instead black plays h6, kicking the knight. And if the knight were to just move back here, well then black castles, is finally a pawn up, can get the pieces out, is actually doing quite well. As long as everything can develop, you know, black has no real issues and is a pawn up. So on h6, white tries this clever move, queen to e2, preparing to triple on the e-file. Black takes the knight, rook e1. Now rook takes e7 is a huge threat. If black were to just castle, then rook takes e7. This rook is just super, super strong, and white is just kind of dominating the e-file. There is bishop e6, but I think this doesn't work tactically. Just takes, and the queen is lost. So this one is not great for black. Instead, what black does is they go for this very, very clever defensive move, bishop e6. Forcing white to take with the pawn, and now f6. And this is kind of deep theory. I mean, there's like 16 moves, but actually this stuff, again, has been known for many years. And I think most e4, e5 players at some point, like I remember learning this line, I think when I was around like 2200, I was learning e4, e5, and this was definitely one of the central lines, you know, I had to learn. And back then I learned the exact same line, f6. Now black's idea is to go c6, get the queen out, castle queenside. And white's still a pawn down. E-pawn is pretty strong, but it's very nicely blockaded by the knight on e7. And now if you feed this position to an engine, it basically says black is much better. So this is why you don't really like see the line at high levels, like basically ever, because people have known this stuff for years. And even like your average, let's say 2200, probably knows this line pretty well if they're an e4, e5 player. And so it makes like no sense for white to try it, because black is, you know, probably gonna know everything. Rook e3 is the one move I remember studying here, with the idea to play like rook h3, try to trade the rooks, and then get queen h5 check and mate. But black goes c6, and black is in time to go like queen b6 and castle. And yeah, in general is doing all right. I think there's one detail here where if white goes rook h3, black should trade gh, and now this is kind of a threat, so maybe you go g6 here. I think is kind of the key move. And then on queen f3, hitting this one, black is a very important tempo, queen a5. Yeah, I remember learning like this exact line years ago, many years ago. And because black gets a tempo on this rook, white doesn't have time to take, and next black will have time to castle, but also more importantly go queen f5 to cover the f pawn. So there haven't really been a lot of updates in this line. And so since then, like, you know, usually if players are, number one, they're not really playing d4 in this position anymore. Like you'll see most games, they're playing c3, d3, and just playing like this lower structure. But even the ones that do, generally they're going to try something else here, like bishop d2 or like knight d2. You know, it's kind of interesting, pawn sacrifice, and so on. Because again, these lines are really well known. But honestly, at lower levels, you know, if you're like 1200, 1400, the chances of your opponents like knowing all this is going to be very small, which is why I feel like these openings are all very playable, and why I often recommend players, you know, just play like actively play for the initiative, because like, you know, your opponents have to kind of prove that they know how to neutralize this very, very direct attempt where, you know, even back in the 1600s was just crushing players. There was actually one game where Jordan Van Forest, I think in this position, against Levon Aronian, of all players, you know, huge e4, e5 specialist. Van Forest tried rook f4 here, which I think was kind of a fresh idea, with the point that he just wanted to take on f6. And sure enough, I believe that this is like, you know, the engine's top choice if you feed this position nowadays. It says black is a little bit better, but okay, if black is a little bit better according to the engine, and they're, you know, full exchange up plus one pawn, that means like white has some very, very significant compensation. And optically, of course, it looks extremely playable, especially in Blitz and Rapid. I think it was like an online Rapid game that he tried, but he ended up winning the game, you know, so kudos. I don't know if it was because of the opening, but still, it's not easy to surprise Aronian in e4, e5 position, end up winning the game. And yeah, I mean, again, like optically, the position looks very, very playable for white, which I think is a good way to kind of judge positions, when, you know, because the engine will tell you like, oh, black is like slightly better, it's like about equal, but yeah, I think, you know, we can kind of evaluate ourselves. So yeah, long story short, what is the idea of the Mahler attack? Well, it's to play for the initiative, I guess is what I would say on that one. There's obviously a lot of like very, very forcing lines, and it's kind of a weird thing where it's like from white's point of view, you know, if you feel like your opponents aren't really going to know what they're doing here, then it's worth playing. You might get some nice wins, but once your opponents do kind of know the territory, most Italian game players eventually end up switching to d2, d3, just kind of playing these slower systems, which I think is kind of a natural progression. So I often recommend folks to, like, you know, start off with the sharper stuff and you know, the gambits, because, you know, why not learn how to play with the initiative, force your opponents to show you that they know how to defend, and then once you feel like, okay, you're playing against a certain level of player that is not going to fall for I mean, I wouldn't even call them opening traps. You're just playing aggressively in the opening, and so once you deal with a player that knows how to like equalize with black properly against like the most natural like aggressive attacks, then you can start, you know, looking into some of the more modern lines. But what happens, this is just totally a separate point, nothing to do with the question at this point, but what happens is people, they start with the main lines. They're like, oh, I should be playing main lines, you know, because that's what the top guys are playing, so that makes sense. They play the best openings, they know, so I should just play what they play. But then you're playing it without all this, like, you know, years of knowledge and experience of like playing the other line. It's like and then it doesn't quite work out, because, you know, you still kind of need knowledge of history and previous positions to understand a lot of the modern stuff. Which yeah, is generally why the advice, you know, for beginners and newer players, just kind of like try to follow like good opening principles in the opening, because that is what will get you to play like a lot of these like classic like normal moves where you're just fighting for the center, fighting for the initiative, you know, trying to use the advantage of the first move, just kind of learning how games can naturally progress. Then once you have like a lot of experience with the structures, you really start getting into it. Then you can start thinking about like, oh, maybe I should start with this move order, you know, and look a little bit more closely at the opening. But until then, it's really more about just, I think, just kind of building up your sense of just kind of general principles in these positions, whether it's open or closed or semi-closed. It doesn't really matter. It's just kind of building up your experience and feeling for these positions. You know, it's a weird thing to say after just ramming off like lines and lines of theory, but I hope I hope that kind of makes sense. And if you're an e4, e5 player, like, I don't think you have to memorize like that whole line and make sure that you're not getting killed in the opening. But it is something, you know, to just kind of be aware of, that, yeah, people can play really, really sharply against you.